It's great to be here again with NDTA and to see so many of my old friends and have the chance to meet new folks and be a part of these discussions. There's already been some great dialogue, and I promise you Panel 4 will not disappoint. Everybody here obviously recognizes the value of strategic ports. We've talked about challenges from multiple perspectives, and this is the kind of collaborative event that's designed to do it and broaden our individual views. In this panel, our speakers are going to try to get into some more specifics on enhancements and really try to address the kind of things that we need to do to help guarantee that our strategic ports continue to meet the military requirements and remain viable in our changing future. So now I'm going to try to manipulate this machine here. All right, that's a title slide. Okay, so first for the introduction of the panel, seated in the middle, and I'm going to do this in order of brief. I'm going to announce and introduce our presenters. John Young comes to us from the American Association of Port Authorities, where he serves as a Director of Freight and Surface Transportation Policy. In addition to his policy responsibilities, he also deals with port security and the Department of Commerce's Supply Chain Initiative. His background includes work as a legislative director in the U.S. Congress, where he worked on numerous important transportation issues. And just prior to joining AAPA, John had his own advocacy firm in Washington, D.C., focusing on transportation, economic development, and environmental issues. Seated immediately to my right, Arnie Dupuy works in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, where he serves as an energy analyst. Specifically, Arnie provides qualitative and quantitative analyses of operational energy risks to mission assurance. And his other areas of interest include geopolitical aspects of energy security within the Transatlantic Alliance, particularly the broader Black Sea. He's an Army veteran retiring with 25 years of service. And lastly, all the way on the end at the right, Steve Ribuffo is the director of the Port of Alaska. Retired career Air Force officer, Steve's been with the port since 2007 when he first came aboard as a deputy director. He's responsible for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the port, an enterprise department of the municipality of Anchorage. He's an accredited Marine Port executive, and he also spends time on numerous boards and in advisory roles. All right, the introduction's done. First, I want to just spend a couple of minutes setting the stage, much of which is on these couple of charts has already been touched on, so I'm going to zip through them rather quick. General Broadmeadow said a lot of this in his lunchtime address. We're meeting here today and we're talking about strategic ports because these ports, among other things, enable our nation's power projection strength. General Lyon's quote at the bottom succinctly captures that as it states about what power means to our defense, noting it underpins the lethality, strong words, underpins the lethality of the joint force. Our ability to strategically move forces across the globe gives us options in today's complex world. It's an ability that's uniquely American, and it's powered by our government and business sectors. And it's something we've been able to do without challenge for many, many years. We've seen this slide a couple times already. That power projection pushes forward from the homeland through a healthy network of strategic seaports. The quote below is from the executive order that recognizes the need to designate this critical infrastructure, and that designation facilitates the processes that are used by DoD and the government and by the ports to ensure that they remain viable and they remain ready. And since 2001, obviously these processes have been used to ensure that port capacity was available with highly successful strategic deployments to missions, a testament to the critical component of our current power projection. So on to the next slide. So to the future. What's in the threats calculus? Well, the threat has obviously been paying attention. And as we move toward a far more complex future, it's certain we're not going to enjoy the freedom. General Broadmeadow made that point. While it's not necessarily their objective to match our key strength of power projection, they're certainly going to act to try and erode ours. Ports, as the general used in his words, are inside of the threat's vectors. This indirect approach of the threats already started with non-kinetic and non-attributable measures using any and all avenues to prevent us from employing this unique national strength in an effort to really stop us before we can even begin. General Farman used the words left of bang, measures short of aggression. Cyber, obviously the big one, but sabotage, social networking efforts, foreign investment, all of these things can potentially make our power projection mission more difficult and maybe change our own decision calculus and try to stop us at the gate before we even get out. You saw in Admiral Clark's slides this morning with the sand charts where he talked about speed. General Farman mentioned it in his presentation. Speed's going to be an important factor like never before, and that's going to demand a redundant capability that's resilient, that can remain effective despite attack, and that hinges once again on our robust government and business sectors and a level of synchronization that'll be unmatched. So, just some initial thoughts. Back to the specific focus of the panel, some hypothetical questions listed here. How do we build that resilience? How do we address aging infrastructure when competition's so tough? How do we tackle tough problems like cyber resilience and potential risk with foreign interest? The folks in this room obviously understand this stuff isn't easy, and to remain effective, we'll need to continue with frank and candid dialogue and ask the tough questions. And I would finally offer to you that organizations like NDTA and conferences like this can definitely help showcase these issues and prompt the conversations that in the end are really the only way that we'll be able to ride the waves of the uncertain future. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to kick things off to John Young, who will recognize the essential role of policy. And John?
Great. Thank you. And thank you, NDTA, Andy, and MARAD and Transcom for putting this together, partnering with AAPA, or allowing AAPA to partner with you on this. This has been a great experience, and I say that because it's one of the benefits of going late in the afternoon is, I have the opportunity to sit back and absorb, all the great information ahead of time, and really kind of think about it and hopefully reflect some of it in my comments. My role with AAPA is I handle the infrastructure portfolio, and that means, land side. I do some on water side, security. And I work with Congress. And when I work with Congress, Congress wants to know what ports need. One good thing about representing ports is every member of Congress and their senators love ports. Steve may disagree with me on that, but nah, I'm just kidding. But he's an anomaly in that sense. But for the most part, we have tremendous support on Capitol Hill, and they want to hear what ports need. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about some of the programs that we work on and kind of reflect it and kind of integrate it into this conversation. Ports have many partners. They have military, of course, but they also have their business partners, their communities, and the federal government. So ports, they're not only multimodal in transportation, but they're distinguished within their communities in terms of who they're dealing with, who they have to appease, and who they have to work with. So we have a lot of programs that reflect this in the federal government. So I'm going to start with one, HMT, Harbor Maintenance Tax. That was a tax that our customers pay for. The shippers, they pay for this. And they pay for this on cargo that comes in through our harbors. And this is very important. It's important because this funding keeps our navigation channels dredged. And without it, nobody moves, right? So the private sector has invested in our ports, and they continue to. Another example is EPA. If you're a port and you're a big port, especially on the coast, your near neighbors are right next to you. So you have to deal with environmental issues. So EPA has a program, DERA program, Diesel Emissions Reduction Program. There's other programs that ports have accessed federally to work on, to help address some of these issues. The Commerce Department, they have economic development grants that different ports work on to help build their niche, build their business plans. DOE is becoming more active because we're talking about electrification of ports making sure that ports are up and running, whether it's a climate issue, whether it's a terrorist issue, whether it's just a sustainability issue. I mean, these are important. These are what ports are looking at now. DHS, incredible partner. They house the Port Security Grant Program. Without it, we wouldn't be able to harden the security around our ports. You know, since 9/11, this program has been up and going, and it really has helped ports not only communicate with their communities, but also secure their communities. Not just the ports, but also the supply chain. It's evolving. I say all this because this is really important. And I think, you know, when you look at ports, you know, we're looking at it from a strategic port perspective today, but, you know, quite frankly, there's a lot of people who look at ports strategically as well. And, you know, I think it's going to be important moving forward that we look at DoD and how they work with ports as well. I know General Farman has talked quite a bit about the operations and how, you know, how things are going to move forward and how much cargo needs to go through. But all these agencies are investing in ports, and that's important because, you know, at the end of the day, when I go up to the Hill and I talk to members of Congress, I say first and foremost that ports are not national resources. So they serve many, many different purposes. And we've kind of grown up around that, especially recently. I failed to mention another program, very important program that Mayor would probably not like me to get off the stage and not mention, but the Ports Act, which is port infrastructure investment that Admiral Busby mentioned. So DOT is also contributing to ports. Or trying to. I mean, there's several programs that help ports, help with the connections, make sure that they're sustainable and part of the community and accessible, not just for strategic ports, but for all ports, for the most part. There's 360 ports in this country, 361 actually. Not all of them are my members, and certainly, as we know, there's only 17 strategic ports. So, you know, that's a big, big amount of stakeholders that DOT alone would have to address. So part of where I'm leading with all this is that I think that DOD has a very focused mission, mission-driven, and I think that there's a real opportunity to help invest in some of these needs that have been discussed all day, that only DOD can do, right? Because you have very specific, DOD has very specific needs, criteria that needs to be addressed. And I will tell you that, you know, a lot of them just marry up to what the ports, you know, what they need. And that's, you know, certainly infrastructure, certainly training. I think that's more DOD focused, but also cyber. You know, our ports work a lot with cyber. It's something that we're trying to address. As any of you know anything about a port, and as I think Larry said earlier, or I'll repeat what we always say, is that if you've been to one port, you've been to one port. And, you know, it's hard to just get one size fits all, especially on something as complex as cyber. But I think from a strategic port perspective, when you have 17 ports, you basically have a cluster. You have an opportunity to do something really collaborative and really good and set up your own network. But now, I just wanted to add one more comment. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but you know, the issue is about projecting strength and infrastructure. And I will tell you this, infrastructure is what I do. And in 1956, President Eisenhower put together the first highway bill. And I'm sure he did it, and I know he did it, because he thought it was a defense issue. We needed to be able to move around the country. So in 1956, it just so happened that the average barge that carried containers carried 500 containers. That was the average. Now, let's fast forward to 2016. That was the first time we ever created a freight program in our country. So the freight program was authorized in the FAST Act. And so that's what, 60 years of not having a freight program? But freight was happening, right? We know that freight was moving in and out of our ports. Now the average, maybe not the average, but the ships that move through our ports carry 18,000 TEUs. So think about that. The industry has invested how many times? At least 8 times in their container ships. And this is just container ships. So, and we haven't invested really anything at all. I mean, if we've invested, we've leveraged other opportunities, or we've built off some of our community resources. So if we're going to project strength, we really need to make these investments. Because that, I mean, right now, the industry has shown that they've invested in their needs through ports, but we're trying to catch up. And I think that's really important. I'll just leave you with a few more other stats. I mean, since 9/11, about ports, container traffic has increased by 71%. Passengers through our ports, big issue. You know, cruise passengers, 98%. Gross global trade through our ports, 37%. So our ports are being used. You can even say they've been taxed. Not literally taxed, but taxed on their infrastructure. So these are, you know, if we're going to use our ports and we're a stakeholder, we need to think about how we're going to make targeted investments, because ports mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but it's always important. They're always important to the well-being of the country. So,
Great, thanks very much. Next up, Arnie is going to provide us with an interesting perspective on how DoD's reliance on the nation's energy infrastructure directly relates to mission assurance and power projection. So, Arnie,
Thanks, Dan.
the clicker is yours.
So what I'd like to do is first a quick disclaimer that while I work in the Pentagon, I am a Booz Allen Hamilton employee. Please don't hold that against me. But so these are my own personal viewpoints and not that of Booz Allen or my DoD office. I'm also not a network engineer. I look at this primarily from a mission assurance, high-level operational, and geostrategic standpoint. So that said, in the last 5 years since I've been working at the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, I've been focusing on what's called operational energy. That is ensuring that the warfighter has the tools that he or she needs to conduct the mission, stay alive, and so on. So looking primarily at liquid fuels, battlefield power issues, mostly in EUCOM and Indo-PACOM. And throughout the last 5 years, there's been a steady drumbeat. Cyber vulnerabilities, particularly as they impact fuel deliveries, battlefield power, cyber hybrid warfare, to the point where after Crimea and the recent events, we've been very, very concerned, particularly in my office, about some of these vulnerabilities, talking about, again, primarily from a mission assurance standpoint. So these are things that I've been addressing fairly heavily. And then more recently, in the last year, I've been talking to people in my community about port security, cyber port security, primarily MOTCO and MOTSU. Because of the sensitivity of these issues, I decided not to bring those up, but to focus on something that is fairly recently in my purview, which is a recent trip I took to Romania, in which I visited the port of Constanta. So I want to try and weave my recent activity in Romania, discussion with the Maritime University of Constanta, and some of the concerns that I have with cyber, energy, and the port security issues. I'm trying to pull together a variety of threads and make some sense out of it for my sake, but also hopefully for the audience, and use this as a point of discussion for going forward. So what I'd like to do is, one thing I like to talk about is that there's really no such thing as a DoD energy infrastructure. We are heavily dependent upon civilian infrastructure to get fuel to where we need to get it. This creates a highly vulnerable supply chain. And arguably, I would say that energy is one of the most impactful and vulnerable of all the shared civilian military assets. Again, any disruption to the fuel supply creates readiness issues, mission assurance issues, morale issues, certainly, leadership credibility. All these things need to be taken into account. And then this is no less a concern for maritime and port security issues also. And the fact that, I like this slide because it shows the earlier generation, the previous generation on the left-hand side, followed by the more capable, more lethal generation of platforms on the right-hand side. Everyone, as I mentioned, is more lethal, more capable, but they all are extremely, in some cases with the F-35, very fuel hungry. So that creates additional strain on the supply chain going forward, which also creates certain vulnerabilities to the supply chain from a cyber perspective. So let me get a little bit further into this. Looking at the fuel supply chain, you see on the left-hand side, extraction. See on the bottom, you see the heavy role that maritime ports play in getting fuel to the refinery down to the last tactical mile, as we call it, down to the warfighter, where it's used in operational perspective. Adding the cyber component to this is something I like to present is, you see at the bottom, you have a pipeline, you have, included in that pipeline, the dynamic there is also port and maritime components. Every one of those red arrows is a vulnerability or an attack vector, sometimes multi-layered within those threat areas. So this gives you an idea of the various attack vectors within the supply, fuel and the power supply that we have in the civilian and the military domains. Again, just a idea of some of the recent cyber attacks on the energy infrastructure, both fuel and power. Again, if you notice the cluster between 2014 and 2016, talking about the Crimea, the events in the Donbass, Ukraine, and so on. So seeing it's part of this drumbeat that I was talking about earlier is getting more and more of a elevated concern. Again, looking at ways that missions can be degraded, looking at the bottom, see the basic infrastructure. As you go higher in the hierarchy, you see that the mission at the very top is extremely vulnerable to any variety of challenges to the fuel supplies. So, shifting this now to the European Command, where some years ago the European Union, their Port Security Agency issued a very harsh report on the status of port security within the European Union, basically within our NATO allies. And you see that I highlighted some of the main points that cybersecurity awareness is low to non-existent. Again, some very scathing commentary from the European Union. So this brings us to our allies in NATO and the challenges that we have in not just power projection, but also with mission assurance and operations in the European U.S.-European Command. I'm going to skim through these fairly quickly because I want to get to some maps, which I think are instructive. So part of this solution that we're looking at is what's called the port community system that is being promoted certainly within the EU, being promoted within the Port of Constanta. Where you take on the left side, you have the current configuration to a more efficient, more streamlined configuration on the right, which looks great, looks very efficient, and enables more efficient use of the port, but it's also extremely vulnerable, as you can see, when you're operating out of a single point of failure, which can impact all other aspects of port operations. So that's a very clear attack vector, a very vulnerable position that we see. Going forward, and just examples of some recent attacks on ports, maritime activities, really in the last year. I imagine most of you are familiar with these, but just wanted to highlight some of these activities going on. So, having tried to establish a foundation between energy, between cyber attacks on the supply chain, going to the Port of Constanta, which is located on the Black Sea. It's, as I understand it, it's the second largest port in Europe after Rotterdam. It's it holds a very strategic position certainly in the Black Sea region, also within our broader Black Sea Eastern European security dynamic. Just some details. This is capabilities. It's a capable port, but it's also a fairly antiquated, as I understand it. It has high vulnerabilities to a combination of kinetic and non-kinetic attacks. It needs to be upgraded, it needs to be made more efficient. In doing so, they are raising in increasing their efficiencies. They also are concerned that this will increase their ability or their vulnerability to cyber attack, particularly since they're probably, if not mistaken, the largest port in the Black Sea after mentioning Rotterdam and also within the Sevastopol and the other ports in the region. This is a critical port. To give you an idea, see on the far right-hand side, Port of Constanta has both inland and external seaward access. So it gives you an idea of the vulnerability and the strategic location that it has within our broader, the NATO and also the European Command's posture. So again, just a quick overview of how things have changed in the last 30 years. We are now even more so a Black Sea power, pushing right up against the and then former Soviet states and the former Warsaw Pact, making us in many respects exposed to potential threats from Russian as an adversary. Also an idea of over the last 10 years or so, 15 years, the number of exercises taking place in Eastern Europe. Again, seeing the increased necessity for, not for operational, but for training purposes and so on, the ability to use these ports, use these assets for resupply and so on. This is what I call, this shows the footprint. So Romania has a very strategic role. Again, not just the Port of Constanta, but we also have a missile defense site in Devaselu. There we use two of the airports there, MK and Henry Coanda for air operations and training and so on. So Romania has a very important role in the U.S. and NATO's defensive posture, particularly in Eastern Europe. I call Romania a strategic anchor with Poland, one of the strategic anchors on the eastern flank. This gives you a broader overview of Romania's position, where the Port of Constanta comes in, how this all fits in. So the idea is that the individuals I spoke to at the Port of Constanta, the university, are that as they develop the port capabilities, they are determined to increase its efficiency, but that also creates a huge vulnerability in attack vectors that they're opening themselves up to. Yeah, I think these are things that we need to consider from planning perspectives, and also from cooperative efforts within our Romanian allies. So let me just run through some of trying to bring this all together. This is, as General Broadmeadow mentioned, this is not going away. In fact, it's probably going to get worse as we derive efficiencies, as we become more networked. We'll also open ourselves up to increased penetrations, attacks from adversaries who want to disrupt not just fuel, but any kind of activity on these ports. And Constanta being an example of what we see, not just in the EUCOM AOR, but also in the U.S. Some of the solutions that again, these are very broad-based solutions, so these are things that I see as being important going forward, is the importance of intergovernmental cooperation at the cyber level. We have cyber task forces with Romania and our allies. I think those need to be developed further. Part of the problem is some of these countries do not have the depth, engineering depth that we have, not to diminish their capabilities, not to diminish their professionalism. They just don't have the depth, the engineering staff, or the infrastructure to develop this type of skill sets that are required. I think this is something that we can and should develop because of our own strengths in the cyber defense area, where we can support our allies and by doing so support our own efforts in this part of the world. This includes intelligence sharing, technology sharing as appropriate, cross-functional education training, educational exchanges, training and education officer exchange, to include exercises, red teams, sharing cyber ranges, things of that nature, where we can develop this strength further. Competing again with partners and allies, and also taking a more of a active and forward-leaning approach to cyber defense, which is I think, important way of determining our role and our leadership role in the cyber defense area. So my view is that this is going to be a problem going forward, particularly as we become more networked, we become deriving more efficiencies. This will also open us up to more attacks, cyber attacks, and the maritime community at large is not immune to this. So let me finish up here, and I'll turn it over to Stan.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Arnie. And lastly, our final speaker, Steve, will provide us a view on the topic from the perspective of Port Director in a key strategic location with a close military footprint that depends on that port for contingency as well as for their daily support. So, Steve.
And I get to show off my audiovisual prowess too. But before I start, I want to add my thanks to just the cast of thousands who had nothing but great things to say about this conference. This is my second strategic port conference, and after the one in Baltimore a couple of years ago, I was really looking forward to the next one. And this MARAD Transcom team combination is. And NDTA has just made a great forum, and I hope we keep this going, and I really do hope we keep it, for many years to come, because there's a lot of value to be gotten from bringing this brain trust together every couple of years and checking up on each other. And I also want to thank Christopher Newport University, particularly for the high quality HVAC system that they have, because I'd have died 4 hours ago if it wasn't for the air conditioning. So I thank you all very much. So in the world of strategic ports, and you heard from quite a few of them this morning, I would argue that the Port of Alaska is a fairly small fish in a very, very big pond. And I looked at the volumes that go through some of these other ports, and even the amount of just military cargo that they carry, and it's impressive. It is levels of volume that in my little space on the planet, we will probably never, ever, ever see. But if you look at the microcosm that is Alaska, we are the big fish. And if SDDC really wants speed of war, and they want mobility, capability, and capacity, I would argue we're the only fish. And it's a challenge, and to know a little bit more about us, I think, is an important thing. The picture, there's the picture. The picture that you're looking at right now is most of the port. There's a little bit that leaks off on the left side of the slide, and there's about another third of the real estate that leaks off. To the right side of the slide. And behind all the trees, up above us on the hill, is Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. We are connected by road and rail and pipeline to that installation, and we are connected by rail to all the other military installations in the state. I would argue that as strategic port military base relationships go, it's pretty cozy up in Alaska, and we take advantage of that all the time. A full 20% of all the volume that crosses the docks in Anchorage every year is in support of the DoD, whether it's deployment, redeployment of military equipment and cargo, or it's fuel for aviation operations and ground operations, if it's back shop and clinic supplies for all the military installations, if it's what's on the store shelves in the commissaries and the exchanges, this is the port it all comes through. So our relationship with DoD goes just beyond deploying and redeploying. I think that's also something that's fairly unique in this environment. And there's only one item or one issue that keeps this port director up at night. And I'm looking at my SDDC friends who are stationed in Anchorage and also who have made visits there, because nobody's gonna pick a fight with me over this one. It is the pervasive corrosion problem that we have from end to end on this port. There is no dock left untouched by this particular situation. We have 1,432 piles that support the wharves in Anchorage. I would challenge my other port director friends to tell me if they even know how many wharf piles they've got that support their docks. But this is the issue that is at the crux of all of our challenges up there in Alaska. And the pictures that you're looking at up there is some newfound damage. The corrosion has been there for, for quite a while, and we chip away at that every year from the standpoint of is we have to be able to keep the structural integrity on the docks, so we do repair work to keep that going. It keeps us able to continue to support the operational loads. Doesn't do a darn thing for seismic protection, and it doesn't do anything for long-term survivability, but it allows us to stay open for business. But those seam breaks at the welds on those piles that you see there were a result of the earthquake that we had on November 30th. Fortunately, there wasn't a lot of it, but there was some concentrated areas where there were a lot of it, and once that's happened to a pile, it's supporting absolutely no weight at all. You go buy a roll of crescent rolls at the grocery store, and it's a pretty firm hard pack. You whack it on the table, take the crescent rolls out, and all you're left with is this flimsy container you can't do much else with. There we are. So we're going to have to take a good hard look at at what it is we have to do this summer as a consequence of that. We spend about $3 million a year doing wharf pile repairs. That picture up in the far right there is what we do. Bring a company in, they create these steel jackets that we form around the piles, particularly down at the mud line, and fill them with grout, and use that to put the structural integrity back into the piling. What we're going to do about these that have basically come unzipped from the mud line all the way up to the deck, that's what the engineers are working on right now. And this is only a temporary fix. This is 10 or 15 years worth of work that stays execution. But we are at a point in time where the engineers have told us we've got between 8 and 9 years of useful life left on these docks before we literally can't do anything more to even maintain the operational loads, and we're going to have to start to work on dock replacement or close the docks. It's become that serious. So we embarked on a big modernization program, which in our vernacular means you've got to demolish everything you have there beyond repair and replace the entire dock infrastructure down at the port. The estimated cost of this today, and we're working on 35% design for most of it, only 100% design for one small portion of it, is coming pretty darn close to about $2 billion. I hear my friends in Beaumont, $80 million for a dock, I would kill for that. I would kill for that. But when you build in all the resiliency requirements that you have that you didn't have 30, 40 years ago, because nobody even could spell the word, here you are doing, you got to do all of that now. The costs add up significantly, and the challenge now is where's the money going to come from to do that? We support 85% of the state of Alaska's population. Do the algebra, that's just north of 500,000 people. They all only eat so much, buy new clothes so often, put gas in their car tanks once a week, buy a new car every 10 years or so. It's a very, very, very predictable demand, and you are never going to see growth in that because stuff that comes across our docks feeds Alaskans. It doesn't transship to any location outside of the state, and we manufacture absolutely nothing for shipping out the other way. So those of you that have business that goes both ways, I envy you, because your cost payers are everywhere. Our cost payers are Alaskans. So to take on that kind of a bill and assume it's got to happen on the backs of 500,000 people is a hell of a challenge, and it ain't going to happen. So without any help, at least from the outside, and of course we're at that point in time where the Alaska state economy isn't the best it's ever been. Back in the day when there were earmarks and Senator Stevens was in Washington, we saw a lot of largesse in Alaska. And when the price of oil was $80 a barrel, the state legislature could afford to fund what we used to call science projects. They give you 10, 20, 30, $40 million, and if it failed, nobody cared. Now, there are stewards that are minding the store, and not only do you have to live with the challenges on the degree of difficulty to get anybody's attention to give you any money, is you're living with the mistakes of the past that you made and the long memories of people who remember what you promised and didn't deliver on the last time they gave you a big chunk of money. So it's really a challenging environment. And where DOD is going to be challenged in this is with respect to our port planning order. When we have to redesign this facility because we know we have challenges with getting the financing for something this large, particularly if we're stuck doing it on our own, we're going to build a facility that serves our commercial purposes. We have enough facility now in the existing one to serve our commercial purposes and have enough slop so that the requirements that are in our port planning order are easily met. I can promise you now, when we build this new facility, that ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen unless you come up with the money to help us get there. Then you're going to have to adjust whatever the plans are for Anchorage to accommodate the facility that you're going to get. So partnering with us, I think, is going to be a pretty important way ahead. And I'll stop talking there. I don't know why we put the helicopter with the Red Cross on it. Maybe it's subliminal, but but I'm looking forward. I'm going to stop right here and look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Okay, well, that concludes the speaker portion, and we have some time left for questions. I guess I'll start off with one, and it's for John. John, you talked about several potential investment and funding areas. Are there any mechanisms out there to synchronize those individual funding efforts toward any kind of a combined effect? And if your thoughts on how that might work.
Sure. I mean, well, I think that's what ports do. They are resourceful and they leverage. And every federal program that I just laid out, whether it be Army Corps funding, whether it be EPA, whether it be economic development, whether it be DOE, whether it be DOT or DHS, pretty much every one of my members is active in those. They have different needs, but my job really is to provide a menu or a buffet of options and opportunities for members to improve their ports and to leverage resources. And as we just heard, I mean, there's other opportunities to do things like with DOD, and as an example. But I think it's not just one opportunity. I think you as a port or as a strategic port have to see how you can leverage the resources that are available, not only in the federal level, but you have partners. Port have partners. There's private sector partners that contribute, as well as community. So I don't think I'm really answering your question directly, but I guess we're trying to lay out opportunities, and I think it's up to ports and their partners to be resourceful and insightful to leverage opportunities.
Okay. Other questions? We have a question. You approach the mic, please.
Hi, John Ditmar, North Carolina Ports. This question is for Arnold. It's actually a two-pronged question. How has the U.S.'s change in domestic oil and gas production changed the equation as far as you see it? I know we saw a lot of your challenges, but certainly I think that's changed the equation. And then also, do you look at alternative fuels as a form of changing equations both here and abroad?
Some great questions. The shale revolution in the United States has given us tremendous strategic leverage. And I could talk about that all afternoon, but I don't think you want to hear that. But it has given us leverage for the U.S. Europeans are still extremely dependent upon Russia and also, to a lesser extent, the Middle East for their own use. As we begin to ramp up our own production here domestically, we can export to our European allies and so on. But that's, and keep in mind that Russia has a very strong hold on these particular Eastern European economies because they've been able to infiltrate them for the last 60, 50, 70 years. So it's very difficult to break that dependency on Russia, particularly for well, for all types of fuel in this case, crude, refined products, and also natural gas. I mean, roughly speaking, Russia provides about 30% of Europe's fossil fuels. And that is not, and especially when we're talking about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline going in, that is not going to change unless the Europeans make some serious, very difficult decisions. We will provide some of the assistance to, export to them, but I think they're going to need to develop their own renewables. And you brought up renewables also. When I meant renewables, I meant alternative sources to Russian fuel, because the 30% dependency is very vulnerable. As far as renewables, yes, that is another consideration. But for operational purposes, there's still no substitute for fossil fuels for operations. You can use, we've looked at using renewables at forward operating bases and so on, primarily to reduce the number of convoys going to these bases, which, that's how you incur a lot of casualties, is resupplying these bases with fuel and water. So if you can make them more self-sufficient, that helps the equation. As far as operational energy, there were opportunities for that, but primarily, at least for this time period now, there is no substitute for, like I said, the fossil fuels. And it's just a fact of life until we start seeing new types of fuels come out, whether it's drop-in fuels, whether it's biofuels that we can blend, that will go away to alleviating this dependency, but for the time being, we're still heavily dependent, militarily anyways, on the fossil fuels.
Further questions?
I'm not sure whether this infrastructure question can be answered by those in the panel, but certainly those in the room, somebody might chime in if they can't, because I think it's something that we need to discuss here and not miss this opportunity. But the infrastructure question has to do with foreign influence. You don't have to read very far in a newspaper or listen to a news telecast to hear about the efforts by foreign nations to come in and purchase critical infrastructure. Well, maybe critical infrastructure isn't the right word, but terminals, transportation companies, and so there are definitely ties to foreign ownerships, and that seems to be increasing. Now, I'm told that when it comes to strategic ports, that gets vetted, and that there's no or very little concern there. But I just wonder, can anybody on the panel talk to that? Have you seen anything that we in the community need to be alerted to? And if not on the panel, then anybody in the audience that would care to speak to it.
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. I mean, I don't think it needs to be, I don't think it's alerting to anybody. I think, this country needs to look at itself in the mirror and say, okay, if other countries want to invest in our infrastructure, why aren't we? I mean, it's as simple as that. I think the easiest way we could get the 710 in Los Angeles, Long Beach built is to put it out to bid and have the Chinese build it. I think they would, right? I mean, I think, so it's a question not so much about, alerting people. I mean, I think we know. I mean, if we build our infrastructure and we manage it the way it should be managed, then I think we'd be okay. I'm giving you a very simplistic answer, but there's other issues. Certainly, you saw what happened with Long Beach. They sold one of their largest terminals yesterday because of some concerns with foreign ownership. But I hope that these type of questions and these type of conversations really reflect on what we expect our infrastructure investments to be, and not just kind of point the finger at who's investing, who owns what. That's my 2 cents.
Well, I'll add a little bit because we've been approached, and when I say we, I'll talk about the municipality, since the municipality owns the port, and they are the overall, they're the overseers of all things financial on our behalf. There has been some interest from foreign companies to come in and either purchase the port or underwrite the investment for the infrastructure repairs. Obviously, that all comes at a price. We're not certain that the terms would be favorable, even though they would get the job done. But to a lot of other people, we're just not an interesting investment because it's pretty broke, and somebody's going to have to fix it and pay to fix it, and those costs are going to get passed on, whether you like it or not. And as a municipality, we can borrow at lower interest rates than the private sector can. So that gives us a fighting chance of at least keeping the rates if we're stuck with only financing this thing or covering the debt service through rate structure changes. That gives us the fighting chance to keep them as low as possible. But there's not a big appetite for it that I have seen in our little world.
I have a question regarding security. We've been talking a lot about cybersecurity. And this question may be for you or the folks in the room. What enhancements are there, if any, or thoughts towards the security from the aspect of what could be in these containers, what could be in the roll-on, roll-off equipment that could be actually weapons that could actually take down the port, exploded or whatever, things like that that may keep you up at night from a security aspect of your vulnerability, what may be coming in and out of your ports. Any comments or anyone in the room?
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll answer for me. We have the luxury, if you will, of being serviced by 2 Jones Act carriers out of the Port of Tacoma. So all the containerized cargo that comes to Anchorage is transshipped through Tacoma. And all of it goes through the rigorous inspections and X-ray detections and what have you that checks for all of that stuff when it's down there getting loaded on ships in Tacoma, and then they come nonstop to Anchorage. So the probability of anything untoward making its way into our port is fairly low, and that's been the business model for as long as I've been there and then some, and so far the success rate's been pretty high. What we get from foreign sources directly are cement that comes in break bulk, and dry bulk rather, and occasionally we'll get cargo that is for construction projects, which is very difficult to hide anything in. And everything that comes off the ship, customs will be there when something big is going on. We usually don't see them for the normal day-to-day stuff, but I don't lose a lot of sleep over that kind of intrusions down on a port. And from a cyber perspective, we're pretty Stone Age. The gantry cranes that we have are not these big cosmic new ones with all the electronics. They're fairly basic infrastructure. I don't have a CIO. Our CIO is the municipality's IT director. All of our systems are the municipality's systems, and they have a very robust cybersecurity department, inside their system. So we don't worry about that at all. I think the tenants who have their own management system separate, have their own capabilities in place, but they don't share that with the landlord. So I can't speak specifically to what it is they do, but I think we're pretty protected in the now. We're doing a lot of paying attention to what's going on everywhere else, because someday we'd like those big cosmic gantry cranes, and we know that there have been places that have been challenged by software that's been embedded in those systems, because the only place you can get them made now is Shanghai, and the FBI is very interested in being part of any kind of a team that's going to accept this kind of new infrastructure that comes into the port, so we can get it all vetted before we actually bring anything online. So we've got long-term plans and a lot of beware of the future, but for right now, in the here and now, we're pretty simple, and they don't like simple. They want complicated stuff.
I would just times at least 83. What Steve just described. I mean, our organization recently released a survey of our members about port security, and our port directors have identified at least $4 billion over the next 10 years that they need to not only maintain what they have for their security apparatus, but also they see the future investments really focusing on cyber, over $2 billion or close to $2 billion, as well as active shooter. I mean, that's another issue, maybe not as active for this audience, but certainly with the cruise ports, that's a big concern as well.
Great. Well, we're right at the end of the time, so on behalf of the entire panel, to Admiral Brown, NDTA, Christopher Newport University, AAPA, and MARAD, thanks for allowing us to come up here and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Stanley.
Yeah, I appreciate it.